the hour, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you, Jen, for the kind remarks. We are all a good-looking group, and I'm sure all the ones that we don't see too. We're just so thrilled to be together. For those who don't know me, although I think you probably know me, I'm Dr. Melissa Merrick, President and CEO here at Prevent Child Abuse America. And we are just so honored and humbled to have our wonderful colleagues, Sam Mellerson and Mike Finley, co-directors from the Burns Institute, joining us today. I'm going to pause and just invite Sam and Mike to introduce themselves. Sam, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Mellerson. I'm one of the executive directors at the Haywood Burns Institute. We have a 3-person executive leadership team as a model for how we believe in sharing power, and just do that internally as we talk with folks about the journey and how sharing power is so important in the work that we do. So glad to be here with everyone. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm Mike Finley, and one of the executive directors of the Burns Institute, and just good to be with folks. I'm working from my home in North Carolina, so it's good to be with a wide network of folk today. So we can't see you, but we can feel you. So it's good to be here with you.
Totally. This bunch, you can always feel the energy in these, even the virtual rooms. We are a passionate and committed bunch, but we, like others in this moment of our shared history of just being alive and present in this moment, we are all on a journey to try to achieve and advance race equity and other forms of equity, especially as it relates to the work that we do, that we're committed to doing in prevention, preventing child abuse and neglect, other adversities. Really, I've been on board as the CEO for a little over 2 years, going on 2.5 years. And it's certainly a commitment of mine that we continue to advance our journey. But we recognize that that's not always linear. And in fact, it's never linear. It's always kind of fluid and difficult. And, you know, a lot of what we've learned as a network, and here what you have represented here today are a combination of our state chapter leaders throughout the country, and also our home visiting leaders around the country. So those are our 2 big networks. And we are all, again, on this journey, but nobody's journey looks the same, as you all know. In full transparency, you know, Sam and Mike have been working with us at PCAA America, with our senior leadership team, to try to understand where we are even in our journey and where we want to head. And I'm just so thankful for their counsel and leadership and just thought partnership in this work. And I think, you know, what Sam and Mike both shared, you know, this like sharing power and really modeling the things that we expect our communities and our families and our partners to also do is part of the journey and part of the leadership that we want to help provide, you know, these connections to experts. They have a lot of expertise, but they are not the only experts. And I know that they share that in full humility and transparency too. But, you know, at PCAA America, we are just committed to, as difficult as this work is, we know that this is the work and that it's not just a piece or something that we just tack on to like our talking points. This is really about embracing a cultural shift, changing narratives. We have a lot of resources in development together with, you know, Burns expertise and counsel, but with some funding that we have from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. We also are doing sort of a strategic brief around race and racism that will be out for our networks early next year. We also have a literature review and process around how race equity shows up in primary prevention. So we know, and I'm sure our conversation will go here a little bit, but we so often are focused on disproportionality in terms of child welfare systems or kind of the bad outcomes. And we talk about disparities and disproportionality, but what about in primary prevention? How does race equity come to play, if you will, in that space? So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Obviously, this is not the only time we will have a conversation like this. Again, this is just one piece of our journey. But again, so thankful to be with Mike and Sam today, and so thankful to all of you who have submitted questions. In the registration process, we got hundreds of questions. So obviously, we're not going to be able to get all of those today, and we're going to keep this really just kind of conversational and informal. But I do have some of the questions that you all submitted, so you may hear yours. So thanks for that. And again, the recording will be available for any of your colleagues, or when you want to look at it again. Certainly, this is again a lot to take in at any given time. So we are just thankful that you are open and with us today. I'll pause there, and my first question will just be to invite Sam and Mike to give any of their own framing to this conversation before we get started with some of these questions that people had for you.
Oh, you're muted.
That's the first test.
Of course.
See whether we can manage the mute. No, I think Melissa, I think you captured it well. I just think this is a journey, and we do. So this whole expert thing for us, we're experienced. We've been doing this, lots of conversations in the field, in the work, but I think we all have an expertise. And so this is really for today, but also as you all go on, it is just leaning into conversations that we know we need to have. And they don't always feel comfortable, but the more you do them, the more they actually feel normal. And then that becomes almost, I don't want to say fun, but it becomes the work. It's the meat of this. And so just encourage folks to, again, today is today. We have a little bit of time with you, but as you go back home and you're in your place, like really think about how do I continue to push myself just to engage in some conversations I haven't had, right? And some new territory I haven't covered. And we're all learning through this. So just wanted to give people that space and that comfort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only thing I would just add is I don't think we can stress enough to just really encourage folks that in a time where we are so preoccupied with particular areas of expertise and what folks really focus on is to really try to break that mental model down and just reject the notion of an absolute expertise. This is a very fluid, ever evolving body of not even work, it's of being, right? It's how we all interact. It's how we grow and live and share space together. So just really encouraging every perspective is important and appreciated as part of the dialogue.
Yeah, no, I love that framing, and I think it's so true to what is needed. And with that, let me just jump right in. And again, thank you to everyone who submitted questions. These are not easy questions to answer, and there's no right or wrong answer. But what we are going to rely on is to hear from Sam and Mike and to explore some ideas and some options that may work in your context and in your organization and in your state, and may not. Right. So I think that is, again, elevating your expertise or your lived expertise certainly is so critical. But there's no kind of one way or one size fits all. I mean, certainly if there was like an aspirin, we'd all take it. And that, or we wouldn't, right? Like sometimes even those things are, you think so simple, but really complex. And I think a lot of the complexity comes from sort of the historical context. So with that in mind, we're just going to go straight to some of these really good questions. How do we actually do this work? Have these conversations, talk about race equity, and be about equity in states that often lack diversity or lack an understanding of the diversity that exists in the states. But then we know that the challenges of racism and discrimination are still pervasive, and it results in disproportionality in the child welfare and other systems, right? So how do we do this difficult work when we're not always aligned?
Yeah, It's a great question. I'm sorry, Mike, did you want to start and I'll
No,
jump?
you good. Go ahead.
Okay. It is. It's a great question. I think there are two ways to kind of think about this. There's the almost like pragmatic way that we tend to work. And so, you know, in a place that has less diversity but still demonstrates a disparity, I would just say like using data to demonstrate where the disparity is really important. Because I think when numbers are small in a population, they can almost hide a little bit, not seem as such a pervasive issue. But when you're able to match it up against the population and really examine, be able to illustrate what the disparity, the disproportionality of that population is within a system is really important to do. And so even so, starting with kind of like that technical approach of being able to use the data to illustrate that there is an issue, and then really engaging those that are most impacted by the issue to understand why this is happening, to get a story behind the data, and just to constantly to consider looking at each of the decision points that align with that data to be able to really dig in and understand where you're seeing the point of disparity and where it begins to grow. And so doing some kind of decision point analysis around that is also really important, because what you want to remember is the disproportionality is not an indication of the population's behavior. It's the system's response, right? It's the system's interaction with people that is creating the disparity. So really being methodical about how decisions are being made and at what points you're seeing those disparities.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, and so even in the framing of the question, right? When we say a place that's lack of diversity, it's being so, and we don't want to make assumptions. Now, if I do make assumptions to say that really means we're in a state that is predominantly white, there are a few numbers of people of color, right? And we have to even be comfortable just saying, being able to articulate that, like just being comfortable with what that means. The process that Sam just laid out, though, is, and you're going to probably hear us say some of that repeatedly in a way, because some of these steps, if you're in Beckley, West Virginia, where there's a very small population of people of color, if you're in Alameda County, where it looks very different, it becomes the same process. So that idea of speaking, talking to, engaging those most impacted, that's just a process, you know what I mean? And so just again, thinking about those steps, but I even wanted to start with saying, right, that even when we pose it as the lack of diversity, what we're saying is, well, often what we're really saying is it's a predominantly white population, and how do we engage folks who this just may not be a priority for them for many reasons, right? And how do we engage those conversations?
Yeah, it's so important what you've said in terms of, you know, calling it what it is, right? But we are so careful. I think we've been trained over time to be so careful not to say white and black, or not to say whatever, right? And so then it jumbles it all. And even it relates to, Sam, your answer about data, you know, certainly, and this pertains to another question that someone submitted: how can we best report data in a way that does not perpetuate cultural biases? Because, you know, sometimes even scientists among us, we look at data and we just want the data to speak for themselves, even though embedded in those data are all of the implicit and sometimes explicit biases. And it doesn't get always, or the data don't always show what you said, Sam, that it's not that we just observe these disparities, it's that there was intentionality in systems that caused the disparities we observe. Can you tell me a little bit, like talk a little bit more about what that makes you think about?
Yeah, this has been coming up a lot for us lately, and it's such a critical question. So anything with data, I cannot stress enough, context matters. Context, right? There is a historical context that needs to be explained. There is, you know, jurisdictional context, there is neighborhood level context. So just the context so folks can understand the data is really important. And we just had a really interesting discussion with a group of researchers who were putting out publications that were very much trying to hold the space of neutrality and just focusing on the actual data points that demonstrated some pretty pervasive disparities. we had to review the material with them to let them actually see that in their desire to hold neutral, like a race neutral perspective in reporting the data, it actually, depending on how you were reading it, it completely reinforced some very negative stereotypes about people of color and how it was written, right? And so just thinking about the context of so important, you know, maybe in an easier way to think about it, because these are all related. All of the things that we're doing are kind of like a parallel process. When you receive some bad news or information and you're gonna send that email to somebody to explain something, and just before you hit send, you think, oh man, I should probably call them, right? Like an email could be read with a tone that may not actually get the message across that I'm trying to get across. And so let me call the person and add some additional context to what I'm saying. Keeping in mind your data, you have the same responsibility of care with the data that you message for communities that you may or may not be connected to, right? And so taking the care and the time to add the context is just critically important.
Critically important, critically important. I couldn't agree more. So another question came in around wanting to expand efforts as an explicitly anti-racist organization. And I know this kind of anti-racist language is popular right now, going beyond diversity to also address issues of equity and combating discrimination. Can we talk a little bit about that? How do we do it? Is that really the goal, to be anti-racist? Is there some other goal? Like, again, sometimes we hear so many different things and we don't know which one is like what we're really, or what the data and the field really are pointing us as like our North Star. Tell me a little bit about your reactions to that question.
Yeah, well, I'll say, I think anti-racist is good. And we want that. And I'm saying that though, but there are terms that will change over time that will evolve. So it's digging in beneath that. So I love the fact, right, that knowing that diversity alone is not enough, right? Diversity is important, it's a step, but just because we're dealing with structural issues, diversity alone is not enough, right? And so then for us, it's really thinking about how do you at every step embed race, ethnic equity into what you're doing. As you think about policies, practices, it's a muscle you have to build. Like, how do we have that eye, right? For everything that we're doing, how do we look at that? You know, how do we think about really developing values? So many of our institutions and agencies are not values driven, which is this interesting thing when you really think about it. Because when we all call our friends, like no matter how busy, it's like, how you doing? Like there's things that you share. There's just a way that we function in our personal lives often, that once you become a professional, it's very much like we're tasked. We have missions, we have these things, and there are things we do. And so how do we break that down and start having conversations about what are our values around the work and how we show up to whatever we're doing, right? And developing those shared values. And really, it's also we used to call this, when we were doing a lot of systems work, systems, like there's a systems maturity around being introspective. Mm-hmm. We need that for our own internal processes. We all have to reflect, and again, in professional spaces, that is not value. Like it's almost trained out of you, right? To reflect on how do you show up? What are your views? When Sam mentioned earlier, mental models, what are the narratives you hold, right? What are you thinking when you're looking at different people who come through your system or your space, or you're making decisions about? So really pushing yourself on those. So I think the anti-racist language is great, and it's important. And I think the fact that it's named so explicitly is really important. But again, it becomes underneath that, what are the important steps? And then the last piece I'll mention is just how do we bring transparency into what we do? So there's a reality that information, when I was younger, you'd hear people say information is power. And I was like, well, I'm 18, I have no information. I don't know what that means. Like, what does that mean? Information is actually absolutely power. And how we decide to communicate, how we don't, and who we bring into those circles is critical. And so how do we create processes that are more transparent? Because, and Sam and I were just talking last night, and it's, when you think of these systems, it's like, well, how do you involve people lived experience? We made this reference of like, these systems they're fully involved with you. They're involved. They are involved in a way that we're not. They're intimately involved at every step of their lives. We are surveilling in invading their space, right? So how do we create processes that are more transparent with information, with data, with decision making, and bring folks into that process? So we just think those are key elements of how you operationalize being anti-racist.
Right, right. Anything to add there, Sam?
No, I mean, I think it's just the part of the thing around the language is just to remember that this is ever evolving, right? And so the language will change next year. It'll be something else, or the year after. And it's okay. I mean, I think it's just for folks to keep their heart in it and to keep working with it. The words are important, and I don't want to minimize that, but also like integrity is most important. So lean into the work, and as the language changes, that's fine. You'll adapt and continue. And I think it's just like Mike said, and to just be really prepared to anchor this in values that you believe in. And this is about people. This is about being in touch with our humanity and seeing each other.
Yeah. I think the values focus is so critical, right? I think sometimes we get a little bit academic in the way that we try to lead organizations or try to implement a home visiting model or whatever, right? We're kind of like, it will take a linear process, which of course discounts that everything is relational, that everything is a journey, that it's about building trust and keeping trust, transparency, integrity, responsibility of care, all these words that we've heard, anti-racism, right? So it's like, none of this is linear again, and it's so reliant on a lot of empathy and grace, not just for each other, but for ourselves. I think we're used to having or wanting to, as leaders in this space and in prevention, we're used to having answers about something, right? We know about evidence, we know about like what works and under what conditions. And so we take this academic approach, which I will never argue really is not important, but it's an important piece. But this values, kind of the soft skills, the parallel process, like all the things that are in the backdrop, the context, that stuff matters. It can exacerbate impacts. It can dilute effects, like, in laboratory-based kinds of things. So it's like, but we come still to organizational administration or leadership thinking, we really need to know like how to lead and what to say, and it's just not true. So let's talk more about that. Like, how do we address, disparities and inequities when leadership among all of us, right? We struggle with our own biases, our own experiences with biases and other things.
Yeah, and I know we both want to chime in on this. I think this is part of it's letting go of the idea that there will be a technical solution to an adaptive challenge, right? And we're so used to the tools and technologies. Just tell us what to do, we'll do it. People ask us all the time to just give them the roadmap, the blueprint. They're going to do every bit of it. And we have no doubt that they would, right? And kind of like you said earlier, if there was a pill to take, maybe you take it, right? I mean, and the reality is just that this is an ever evolving, like, just way of being, right? I mean, this is where we've seen, kind of the structural racism has morphed and sophisticated itself over time, right? This is the reality. Our solutions have to be just as sophisticated in our approach, right? The detailed thinking, the approaches, the embedding of, and not having a shelf of here's going to be an equity person or position that's then going to monitor everything across, all areas. Usually position that will just add with like very little authority across the agency or organization in which they're embedded, right? And so it really is thinking about how are we embedding this in all that we do, and being very open to the idea that, I mean, really, when we say to reject this notion of an expert culture, that is to free yourself from that, right? Like, let that go and allow yourself to know that you're going to make mistakes. It's okay. Right? Lean into this and really get dirty with it, play around, figure it out. And just really, I can't stress enough, being open and vulnerable, because this is where we find our most critical innovation to solutions in the most complex problems, is through our own vulnerability and innovation, right? So creating that space for leaders to also be able to really engage their teams is just, yeah, it's just really important.
And Melissa, I just wanted to add, right, as we're talking, and it's because I wasn't even thinking of going here, but it's like, because so much of this is the professionalization of how we even think and talk and what we do. So when we even, it's like adaptive versus technical. I feel like some people are like, oh, adaptive, oh, that's that woo-saw stuff. What are we doing, right? Values, oh, that's that, like, we got to talk about our feelings. But again, and when we talk about like history, right? So for us, historical competence, like really understanding how we got here. People say, well, I'm not responsible for that. And we'll say, well, right, but these issues are structural. But deeper than that, in every other aspect of your life, history matters, right? That's why Carfax exists, right? I want to buy a car. What's the history of this car? I'm going to do a home inspection on the house I'm going to buy. Why? I want to know when the roof was put on. Like, history matters, right? And so it's just, for a lot of this, it is just taking some things that we actually do, but we do it on our little unique, our little tribes, our little groups, our little factions, right? But how do we bring that energy, that creativity, that humanity, that care? And again, I'm not, the joke in my house, like, I'm not the touchy-feely, but actually we all are, because when we're at home, that's who we are in all different ways, right? So how do you bring that level of common sense to what feel like massive problems? But actually, if you break it apart, so that leader's question, folks have to lean in, and we have to bring people into the table. And then lastly on that, it's having the grace that, and Sam kind of touched on this earlier, we're all gonna be a little clunky. We're all gonna be a little clunky, and we have to give grace to those who are gonna be clunky. And for those of us who feel like, well, this is my issue, I also have to have grace to accept that. And I need grace when I'm feeling impatient, when I'm feeling frustrated, when I'm a little upset at somebody not knowing something I think they should know, and so create that space together.
Well, and I just think the vulnerability and being, trusting the process to be vulnerable, right? Creating that space of vulnerability. And I think actually, so when Sam and Mike were working with PCA's like senior team, it was like, there was some language around, is this a safe space or is this a space to be brave, right? And that it's different. Sharing may not feel that safe, right? And so that's why you have to build relationships first, and you have to have some shared values and some shared commitment and such. But tell me a little bit more about that, like, vulnerable space, because I just know that many of us, we're just not used to presenting a vulnerable side to our organizations, our teams, again, like, you can imagine many reasons why people don't want to do that. So tell me a little bit more about that, because I found just experiencing that very compelling, but like in a very visceral way. And so tell me what I'm forgetting, Sam, about what you taught me.
I mean, I think, I think it's just, so if we look back, right, and I'm gonna keep going with this theme around history and even the way that we work in human services, right? We have decided to approach the sector as one that, we were going to, there was a long time, even in doing racial justice work, that we would not allow emotion to be in the room, right? This is the whole, why we use data so much in the beginning, was just a data conversation. Data was to eliminate any emotion from the conversation and to just keep it fact focused, right? And, I think the way that we've all worked has been this kind of, you have your expert culture, the particular issue areas that you focus in, you dive all the way in. Nonprofits, so you work like above and beyond, probably 4 or 5 jobs within your role, right? Like, this is, and what has it really gotten us, right? Like, really, what has it gotten us in terms of our own personal family return and time, and what does that imbalance look like? What has it gotten our organizations? We may do well in a particular performance metric, grant, or deliverable, but when we truly are looking at the larger outcomes and the pervasive disparities that exist, like, until we really care about how all children are faring, we're all failing, right? And this is the reality. part of what we've wrestled with over time has been this very like results-based focus. Results are important, don't get me wrong, but we can't only look at the results. It used to be focus on the metrics, forget the hearts and minds. And we're saying like, no, actually you have to do, it's a both and. It's continue to look at the metrics, hold ourselves accountable to deliver that, but absolutely engage our hearts and minds and how we do this, because that is the everlasting change that lasts beyond any one of us, right? That continues beyond us. And it's a culture shift. And the last thing I'll say about with regard to leadership, I remember sitting in on a session where a CEO of a very large organization spoke about how he started a staff meeting once that he was going to be very vulnerable with his team. And he came in with a slide that had all of the things, I think he titled it, I'm not going to curse because I think it had a curse word in it, but it said like all of the stuff that I do poorly, right?
Mhm.
And he listed all these things. And he said he was so shocked that when he walked in the room and he had this up on the screen, everyone around the table was saying like, oh my, he totally does that. Like, oh, that is so him, right? Sucks at that. Look at how he put, and they were joking and they knew. And what was the light bulb went off for him was, oh yeah, I'm not actually hiding any of these things. People see it, we see each other, right? So why not just be open about it and allow ourselves to grow together in a way that is supportive and creates an environment of shared learning.
Yeah, I just see, I swear it's so funny you ended with that, because if I start, that's what I would start with. Exactly. It's just the and that's the professional thing we do is we literally, you just stop being human in a way. So and I joke because I came up in the justice space and we didn't do check-ins, we didn't talk values. Burns 20 years ago had a slide that said, we're not changing attitudes. Because we were like, well, we're not going to get folk, and the evolution has been, well, but that makes no sense. We have to. That's the both and part, right? But I think folks should know when we're in these meeting spaces, we all see each other.
Mm-hmm.
We all see, after George Floyd, we all knew the emotions and the things. We didn't want to say it necessarily. And I think where there was movement is people start articulating their frustration or feelings or confusion or angst or lack of clarity. People put more of that out there, but we all saw each other. And the other thing I'll just add, not to overtalk this point, but I think it's so critical, is because if you don't, then, and when Sam was saying, yeah, and so what have the results been? Part of it is we all then create our own narratives about each other, about organizations, about what you do. And so then we just create our own stories, right? And we stay in our silos. Yeah. And that's not benefiting the folks that we say who's on behalf of who we work, right?
Right. No, I think that this is so powerful. But, I think you all know that I'm trained as a child psychologist, and maybe one of the reasons I was drawn to psychology was because of like the backstory that we all create. I mean, we all do it, right? Something needs to make sense, so we just and maybe our backstory changes based on like wanting to protect ourselves or our own feelings, or make sense of something that seems nonsensical or whatever. So when I hear this conversation, I think that when we make a commitment to equity and when we make a commitment to doing this work, we're actually requiring all of us, like all of me, to do the work, not just my degree or my profession, but me as a mom, me as a woman, me as a minority, me as all the things. So this is where it brings to me like intersectionality, right, into the conversation. I know we've talked some about this, but help me understand, and this question is somewhere in here, but the spirit of the question is, we are wanting people to bring all of themselves, right, to this work. But all of themselves is a lot of things. And and so that seems like a lot, and it seems like super vulnerable. And so then, like, do people have to prioritize what they bring? Or tell me more about intersectionality, bringing your whole self, and doing that in the context of an organization that you're used to being like professional and devoid of emotion and wholeness.
I want to say that I think it's important to note that you can hold the true fullness of who you are and still be professional in a professional setting. So I don't want to
Yes.
let that go completely.
Yes. Yes.
But I do think, like, all of us, and I would be shocked if anybody joining us today can say that they've ever that they have never experienced not being able to fully be themselves, and really how painful that is, right? There's something when you're compartmentalizing who you are to have acceptance, or to be able to be part of a team, or to move an agenda forward. There is something that we are doing when we are not fully who we are that can be tolerable, I think, for a short period of time, but in the long run could actually just really make us very unhappy, and can lead to very kind of toxic culture. Folks need to be able to be themselves, right? And so, I just think the importance of acknowledging that and accepting the true diversity of who we all are is so important, and leads to the richness of what we come up with, right? And we joke about it at the Burns Institute all the time, and saying we have a very diverse team. And we always say that our diversity is our greatest asset, and it is absolutely the hardest thing to manage, because really diverse people includes perspectives. Let's not just get lost on the physical way that we show up or our personal preferences, but truly, like, we all have different ideas about how we're going to get to a particular place, and how we experience something in the moment differs widely, right? And so appreciating that and struggling through that is really, I think, where folks can get to a place that is really great on the other side. When we talk about a shared, I'm sorry, Mike, and
you're good.
Quiet in one sec. When we talk about our shared leadership model with the three of us, and I wish Shaka was here to be able to jump in too, when we are attacking an issue, it is never that we are all in full alignment. Like, we will dive in and start to pull it apart, but we never leave when one person still feels totally unsettled, because we trust enough of each of us enough to know that if something is not sitting well with one of us, then we have to honor and explore that, and realize what is it that it's under there that we're missing. From my perspective, I must have a blind spot. I must not be realizing something that is landing so differently for somebody else. And when we drill down and we come to our compromise and make our decision, it's one that we always say, like, each one of us will walk away feeling better with where we landed, and knowing that that was so much richer than any one of us could have done alone.
Right.
Yeah, I almost don't want to follow. I feel like that was like the perfect sentiment.
Until the next time we have a debate, right? Until you'll forget all about it.
Exactly. But the flip of, and so what I also want to say though is there's terms, right? So intersectionality has also become something that I feel like it's what we just said. And it's important because people need to be able to show up as who they are. And then the flip side of that is to also understand that at the end of the day, the core of who all of us are, there's some base things we want, right? There's some base needs we want. So when we're talking about the shared leadership as an example, well, that's based on respect. The reason it works is we have the highest level of respect for one another. That helps us navigate this, right? So as we're talking about these issues and how you engage race equity and that work deeper, right? And we're talking about the shared values development. It's the core is these base needs that people need: respect, value my experience, right? There's just some things that we all actually want that we had to start naming. And I feel like we're all good at naming it at the conference when this is all our children. And we do that. And they've been to those conferences. We probably put some of them on. We get it. That's right. But it is literally that, and the energy we feel in that moment, which is beautiful and real, just like trainings we go to and people will hold hands. And I used to do this thing where we sing Kumbaya and we cry but then where do we go? We go back to our segregated neighborhoods. We go back to our separate spaces and we just kind of function how we function. And we're trying to say we have to bring this together so that vulnerability piece is part of bringing that self. And it's amazing learning, because the other part of all this is, and people experience it on a micro level with people. When you're on an airplane, have some conversation with somebody who's different than you, you're like, oh, that's really cool. It's how to bring that experience in a broader way, right? It benefits the actual work we're trying to do.
Well, even just like listening to all these pieces, right? And like bringing your whole self and compromise and, you know, honoring someone else's perspective. We know that this is all part of the journey, but we also know that this is hard and it takes a long time. It certainly takes a lot more time than something that's prescriptive or a technical solution to an adaptive challenge, as you said, Sam. So how do we give ourselves, our organizations, our communities, our, you know, work, the time, the permission, and, you know, to take the time that it's going to take when we know that we're still very much in cycles that are like time limited, right? Like we want to see impacts of this grant funding by and we want to, you know, so help me understand whether there are tools or techniques or messaging or what that will allow all of us to have that time that it takes to truly thoughtfully confront and present our vulnerabilities and to really show up in a real way to kind of advance this journey.
Yeah, it really, and time is tough, and I want to honor that and also say we make time for things that we need to make time for, right? And this is really about reassessing our values. And when we know we need to do, because if there was another proposal that came and said, hey, we need this done in the next 5 days, create a whole plan for this and you'll get X number of dollars that will, you know, just grow all these programs, and we would do it. We'd find a way to do it, right? And then when it comes to taking the time to engage in conversation, to explore, to be a little more transparent, right? To have discussions that folks can offer their thoughts and opinions and engage, and to engage community. I'll tell you, the first time constraint we always hear, there's never time to engage community. There's never time to ask those that will be impacted by our decision, what will happen when we make this decision, right? There's no time for that conversation. And it's just, I think, really forcing ourselves to sit down and like, there has to be sometimes a very real conversation around what can we not do in this moment, because this is the time we are going to take to do this here, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and just one other thing on and then I think there's also an onus on folks who are in leadership positions in different spaces to, as we're thinking, when you mentioned grants and deliverables and contracts, like of what conversations we are having with those folks, right? Who are providing those resources to start to shift some of these conversations and shift those timelines, and not, you know, and to dig into that, because there is a reality to all this, right? That we are all bumping up against, but we all need to tackle that and voice those things and articulate that and educate and coach those folks to help, you know, eliminate that.
Yeah, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't just, you know, flat out bring this part up, where we know that, you know, there's no time to hear from the community, and we hear that for many, many years, right? We want to have the program, and then we're shocked when it doesn't work in a community because that's not what the community needed or wanted. So this elevation of community voice and community expertise, lived expertise, this is something that I think we all on this call like have made a commitment to. But there are some that still are concerned, right? Because that's not what they're used to, that by giving or sharing and co-creating, sharing power and co-designing with community, that there's something that's going to be lost, right? In the leadership of whatever. And in fact, one of the questions that came up is there a possibility of losing the issue of race equity if it's moved within community well-being? I have a lot of reactions to that question myself, but I want to hear your thoughts on it.
Mike, did you want to start in just framing it with
just I mean, so because I know folks watched our video prior to this, and so for us, we have a structural well-being framework, and so when the reference is around that loss, for us, the well-being framework for us is done to dismantle structural racism.
Right.
That is why we are doing that. There's not another reason why. And the reason we're talking well-being is because it's not just about youth detention or jails or child, well, it is to say well-being broad, right? So, but for us, it's directly squarely centered, race equity squarely centered, and that can't be lost because it's inherent in the work.
Yeah, yeah.
I do want to just add, I think it's important, you know, when folks do feel that loss almost when engaging in a different way, I think it is important to acknowledge, right? Because I think that loss feels very real for people. I think it's also important to state, you know, very clearly that equity can feel really oppressive to people that hold a lot of privilege, right? When you have to share privilege in a way that you're not used to, don't necessarily want to, right? And I think it is a bit of and even for the folks that like to hold it in that way, for whatever reason, because I think folks hold on to power for a number of different reasons, both personally and professionally. I think it's like, it's a bit of, it's a muscle, right? That you're gonna start training to do differently. And it does take time in the beginning, like when as practice changes to be more inclusive, in the beginning, it will feel like it takes more time. You know, you're not perfect at it yet. Learning to ride a bike, right? You're going to fall a couple times, you're going to figure it out, you're going to keep going. After a while, though, you'll notice that you get to your destinations so much faster, right? Once it's in and the muscle is developed, and this is now part of the practice and what you do, there'll be a time when you look back and think like, oh man, remember when I didn't even want to have this table? I couldn't even imagine. There's something about sharing power in a way that eliminates, I think, one of the biggest stressors in the nonprofit sector or human service sector, which is around personal accountability. When you are sharing power and sharing decision-making and engaging folks, there is a community of cover for you when something goes drastically wrong, because things happen and sometimes something will go wrong. But when you've all done it with this much thoughtfulness and planning and engagement and participation, it is such a different moment than when you are holding something by yourself, convinced that you're going to be that person to take whatever comes down from that, right? It's just a very different, it's just a different way of working.
Yeah. I love that analogy of exercising a muscle, you know, because none of us expect to your first time at the gym lift 300 pounds, right? We know like it could start with 2 pounds, right?
I expect that. I get very upset when it doesn't happen that way.
You know, but you get better, you practice it, you get better at it. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be great at it, but this exercising it, like getting used to, you know, we've talked a lot about on these chapter webinars and different calls with our network about, you know, getting more comfortable with discomfort and getting more comfortable having these difficult. And then, you know, by the third, fourth time, maybe you feel like, okay, I didn't totally mess that up or whatever, you know, it just helps practice. And I think that that's really true to how this work happens. It's also the time that it takes, but maybe it takes a lot of time in the beginning. And then it's a little bit smoother, you know, as it's more embedded in the culture and that it's really valued. Like this is part of the process. Like we cannot get to step 4 until we do all of these other things, right? So one other question that I really wanted to make sure we got to is if you can talk a little bit about how achieving justice aligns with promoting health equity. Unfortunately, I've heard health equity and justice pitted against each other at many meetings. And so I, again, have opinions, but I want to hear yours. How do they align or are they misaligned? And, you know, is one our goal and not the other, or how do they coexist?
Yeah, I'll start. And then I would love to hear your the counter perspectives that you're hearing or your thoughts on this too. That's really interesting. I think for us, actually, we tend to try to draw like pretty consistent parallels between health equity and justice. For us, we used to lift up a lot when social determinants of health really became the conversation that everybody was having. And it was really refreshing to see people lean into that conversation, because the beauty of it was they were actually talking about the impact of structural racism without ever really naming structural racism. They, you know, it would be the root cause of this and that. It would be the inequities of, you know, your physical environment, your different things like that. And when you really unpack that, ultimately, you know, we're pointing to the exact same social constructs, right? One framed in the concept of physical health or sometimes mental health. And it seemed very divorced from this notion of justice. We try to really marry the concepts together because the genius in the social determinants of health frame, and I think why it took kind of the field by storm the way it did as folks bought in, was that it finally eliminated the thinking of like one person's decision to potentially like eat something unhealthy was now leading to all of these massive health disparities, right? Instead, it had you really take a step back and look at the hundreds of decisions that are made around and for that person prior to them ever making a decision that has contributed to an inequity. We see justice in very much the same way when you think about educational access, opportunity, when you think about healthy food, where food deserts are, when you think about, you know, chronic disinvestment in communities, you know, when you think about the wealth gap, like there are all these different things when you look at those root causes across all of those sectors that then put some folks on a path to great success and trajectory, and it puts others on a very different path. And so that's how we tend to mirror those concepts.
Yeah, yeah. I love that marriage of justice and health equity, of course, because again, especially in the prevention space among this group, you know, we are talking always about how do we create the conditions for health, for well-being, for prosperity. You know, to me, that is the work, right? We're talking about prevention, but yes, the structural and social determinants of health contribute to what we have, what work we have to do, right? To dismantle, to disrupt, to transform, all of these other words that, you know, are really getting a lot of play in a good way now too. I think what I've heard a lot is, especially when you take like a public health approach or you focus on health equity, that it's somehow divorce of like wanting to do the right thing, or, you know, that the values that are in a justice frame, right? It's like we should focus on it because it's the right thing. Mm-hmm. And I think the marriage is true. Like, look, I don't care kind of what frame it is. If we have conditions that are supportive of families and communities and set them up, you know, on trajectories to thrive, that's really different than some of the sociopolitical conditions that we do have. So yeah, the bottom of the pair of aces tree, right? Where we've always looked at these leaves on a tree and we're like, oh, there are these aces, as if like they just came to be. No, they came because in the roots are systemic racism and disproportionality and inequities in housing and labor and income and all these other things. That really a lot are the policies that we designed to create the disparities that we observe, right? So I think the marriage is right on. So we have 4 minutes left. What haven't we talked about that you all wanted to share with our network?
I would really love to, and sorry, Mike, I probably.
Oh, you're good. Stop it. Stop it.
I was hoping, just because this is a prevention space, that I thought I would love to have an opportunity to just open folks to the possibility of really thinking about how important it is for folks in prevention to really anchor their strategies and work in a racial justice frame, to really anchor it. And I think it's because prevention without a racial justice focus is really an effort to prevent white families and white children from experiencing whatever the issue is that we're discussing, whether it be family separation or other health disparities. And I say that because without intentionally focusing on race and ethnicity, the strategies will always by default cater to white normative culture, because that is the culture that we're in. And so it's not to ever position folks in a way that is an either or. It's always a both and, but in order to get to a both and, we have to really focus on race and ethnicity in a very intentional way in the prevention space. So just because this is the audience, I just really wanted to share that sentiment, because I think oftentimes prevention can be a amazing space for innovation, creativity, to really connect with communities in so many significant ways. And by not lifting up the race and ethnicity of those partnerships and in those communities, it's doing a disservice to the sector in a way, right? Where prevention spaces should be out in front leading these conversations, where tend to have almost been a bit of a neutral position that we just think is really important to examine.
It's like those unintended consequences, right?
Absolutely.
We mean well, but if we're not explicit about why and what and with whom and all of that, then we really just perpetuate the status quo, which is not what we're in the business of wanting to do. Mike, any last thoughts that you wanted to share with our group?
No, I hope this was helpful for folks. And I think just, you know, it's just leaning in. I just think for me, the conversation piece and then operationalizing that. So even if you heard anything we said and if it made you feel like, I feel a certain way about something that was just said, think about it, reflect on that. Because this isn't so much a right or wrong, but it is challenging yourself, because we have to do some things differently. We know that.
Yeah.
Right. And so challenge yourself, lean in. And again, hopefully folks found this beneficial. So appreciate it.
Or send Mike a strongly worded email so that he can engage.
That happens too.
Yeah. I see some comments in the chat about, you know, the approach to prevention is a whole new conversation to have, and that it's an excellent and needed conversation, which has to be ongoing. And I couldn't underscore that enough. This is, you know, PCA is committed to continuing to have these conversations, listening to each other, listening to communities, sharing power for prevention solutions too, which is uncharted territory. We are so thankful to Sam and Michael's partnership to help us and join us in this kind of journey. But I just have to say that for me, this hour, every time I get to speak to you, I think I'm, you know, learning a lot, but also just activating different parts of my brain, right? And think and experiencing a lot of what we talk about in a really whole way, which I think to me is tremendous, and it's really compelling. And I'm just really thankful to have you all with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.